Hi, my name is Dan, and this is one of my videos where I give a glimpse of the city of Hartford, Connecticut before it was changed by urban renewal in the mid to late 20th century. One of the distinctive modern buildings in Hartford is located at 20 Church Street, at the corner of Main Street just north of Christ Church Cathedral and across the street from the G. Fox Building. Constructed in 1981, its official name is One Corporate Center, but it is commonly referred to as the Stilts Building due to its unusual lower section, where steel vertical girders connect the building to a parking garage at the base. The Stilts Building is part of a block, bound on the east by Main Street, on the south by Church Street, on the west by Trumbull Street, and on the north by Interstate 84. In addition to the Stilts Building, the block includes the Hartford Stage and the previously mentioned parking garage. But what was this area like before the Stilts Building was erected? This photograph from 1920 shows a westward view from the corner of Main Street down the north side of Church Street. This is where the south side of the Stilts Building and the Hartford Stage are located today. A variety of buildings lined Church Street at the time, occupied by various businesses, including a hotel. The tallest building on the block was called the Century Building. Erected in 1919, this 7-story building contained 95 offices, and there were 4 stores on the ground floor. This later photograph from 1965 shows the west side of Main Street, north of the intersection with Church Street. This is where the east side of the Stilts Building is today. At the time, the storefront at the corner of Main and Church was occupied by the Peanut Store, a business which is still fondly remembered today for its aroma of roasting nuts and for appearances by Mr. Peanut, who would stroll the streets with his cane, top hat, and monocle. Just north of that building was the American Industrial Building, which in 1965 had Kay's Jewelers on the first floor. Next to that were the Leonard Building and the Strand Theater, which was the last of Hartford's downtown movie theaters to finally shut down. I'll talk more about these buildings later in the video, but first, let's go back almost a century earlier. This is a section of the 1877 bird's eye view of Hartford. The only building shown here that still exists today is Christ Church Cathedral. Just north of it, the area occupied today by the Stilts Building back then had a variety of wood-framed buildings along both Main and Church Streets. Further west along Church Street was the area now occupied by the Hartford Stage. Back then, the area with buildings in this vicinity extended much further north than it does today. That's because in the 1960s, the interstate highway would cut through this formerly built-up section. Returning to the buildings along Main Street, where the Stilts Building stands today, the building on the corner that later became home to the Peanut Store was probably built in the early 19th century and originally had 3 stories and a gable roof. By the time of this postcard of Christ Church, the corner building had acquired an additional floor and a flat roof. This is a view down Main Street from the first decade of the 20th century. It shows the corner building and the 2 adjacent buildings to the north. On the right is a section of a view from 1930. By that time, those 2 buildings had been replaced by the American Industrial Building. The corner building had also had some significant changes. For one thing, the ground floor facade and the row of windows above had been extended out from the angled front of the building. But there had been an even more extreme alteration. The building no longer extended as far south as it had before, because in 1918, the side of the building along Church Street had been taken off as part of a street widening project. Church Street was widened on both sides from Main Street all the way to Union Place, and this required about 40 buildings along the street to have 8 feet of their front section sliced off to make room for the widening. With World War I not yet ended in Europe, it became a cliché in Hartford at the time to compare the appearance of Church Street to a battle-damaged village on the edge of no man's land. With such extreme work having to be done on so many buildings, the city's Board of Street Commissioners had paid out hundreds of thousands of dollars in damages to the affected property owners, subtracting amounts calculated for the projected benefits of the widening. This view westwards from Main Street shows the north side of Church Street, including the building on the corner of Church and Main, when part of the structure was being removed. This picture shows a slightly later stage of the work on the building, and by the time of this picture, the actual widening of the street itself appears to have started. There is a sign indicating one of the businesses which briefly occupied space in the building, the Cushman Music Shop. This corner building had already been extensively remodeled just 2 years earlier, in 1916, when a clothing store called Crawford's had moved in. The store even referred to its location as Style Corner. In 1918, both Crawford's and the estate that owned the building were separately awarded money for damages, but there was a portion which was claimed by both parties. That led to several years of litigation. In any event, Crawford's did not continue to occupy the building after the street widening. The building was actually sold the following year to Newton, Robertson and Company, a prominent Hartford bakery, which had its main office on Asylum Street. By the time of these photographs of the corner of Main and Church Streets in 1920, Newton Robertson had opened a soda fountain and luncheonette on the street floor, and the Anarcho Grill and Tea Room on the second floor. Newton Robertson would move out of this building in the mid-1920s. The Main Street storefront would then be occupied by a number of different businesses until the Peanut Store moved in 1953. The Peanut Store had opened at its original location of 755 Main Street on October 7, 1938. 15 years later, the Peanut Store moved to 977 Main Street at the corner of Main and Church. The store would remain there until around 1968, when it moved to 9 Asylum Street, and there it would remain until it finally closed in 1998. This is another photograph from 1920. It shows the corner building I've been talking about on the left. By this time, the old buildings just north of it had been demolished to make way for the construction of a new 16-story skyscraper, which is shown here in this street view from 1930. Completed in 1921, it was erected by the American Industrial Bank and Trust Company and was rented out to numerous business tenants. The building's architect was George Zunner, and the general contractor was William F. O'Neill. North of the American Industrial Building were two other structures, the Leonard Building, completed in 1920, and the Strand Theater, opened in 1914. Over 20 years earlier, this block had a very different appearance. As I mentioned before, there were two 19th century buildings in the space where the American Industrial Building would be erected. Where the Leonard Building would be put up in 1920 had stood a Hartford institution, a hotel that dated back to the early 19th century at least. By the time of this 1890s photo, it was called the Arlington House, but it had earlier been known as the Revere House and was most well remembered as the St. John's Hotel. In its early years, the hotel was located on the ground floor, and a wide veranda extended across the entire front of the building. This was a popular spot for local politicians to gather. But times changed, and by the mid-19th century, the first floor was deemed more valuable for store rentals. In 1856, the St. John's was purchased by Newton Carter, who moved the hotel to the upper floors and raised the building by 1 story. In the early 20th century, the Arlington House became Brem's Hotel before it was finally taken down in 1920 to make way for the Leonard Building. Located behind the hotel were the St. John's stables, which had room for 50 horses. One night there had been a fire at the stables, and old-timers long remembered the sight of one horse, ablaze from head to tail, that reared up and had remained in that position for several seconds. Another oft-told tale of the St. John's Hotel related back to the days when politicians did their wheeling and dealing on its wide veranda. One of the most influential of these was a man named Sidney Linney, who had a particularly high tenor voice that rose to a falsetto when he was excited. Whenever he wanted to have a private word with someone, he would take them aside to the driveway that led to the stables. But due to his high-pitched voice, people on the hotel's porch still heard every word he said. Connected to the hotel was a 2-story building that contained several businesses. In the 1890s, the upper floor at 447.5, 449, and 451 Main Street was occupied by Olson Photographer. On the first floor, one of the businesses was that of George H. Weeks, a tobacconist. Just north of the hotel building and the building that housed Olson and Weeks was a colonial-era house. By the 1890s, the former residence was occupied by George F. Abel's furniture store. The building was demolished in May of 1898, shortly after this photograph was taken. The house was built in 1770 for Samuel Talcott, son of Governor Joseph Talcott. If you want to learn more about this house and the historical relics that were discovered inside during its demolition, check out my video, Three Colonial Houses That Once Stood on Main Street, which I'll link in the description below. In that video, I also talk about the shoe merchant who occupied the building just north of the Talcott House. Named George M. Goodell, he was once trailed by a police carriage all the way out to then rural West Hartford because he was suspected of being headed to an illegal cockfight. Goodell would eventually go bankrupt. Earlier, the building had been owned by Dr. W. A. M. Wainwright, a surgeon who died in 1894 after he accidentally shot himself with a pistol he was cleaning. This photograph was taken in 1902 and shows the 1-story commercial structure that had replaced both the Talcott House and the adjacent building to the south. This structure would be replaced in 1914 by the Strand Theater, pictured here on the right in this photograph. On the left is the Leonard Building, which, as I mentioned earlier, replaced the old St. John's Hotel. The Strand was a movie palace that originally featured a 3-manual Austin pipe organ. The theater marquee pictured here dates to 1947, when the Strand underwent a major renovation and remodeling. This photo from 1943 features the theater's previous marquee. This photograph from the 1920s is a view south down Main Street. Here, the Strand Theater displays an even earlier marquee. North of the theater, where the Wainwright Building had once stood, a new building was erected in 1920 to 21. It was a 4-story commercial building designed by architect Daniel A. Guerriere and was built for 2 brothers-in-law, Judge Francis A. Pallotti and Antonio S. Andretta. At the time, Pallotti was serving as judge of the Hartford Police Court. He would later serve as Secretary of the State, State Attorney General, and judge on the State Superior Court. His father, Nicholas Pallotti, had founded Pallotti, Andretta and Company, a private bank. The judge's brother-in-law, Antonio S. Andretta, was president of the bank. Pallotti, Andretta and Company was located on Windsor Street and had branches in New Haven, Connecticut, and Naples, Italy. The bank did not survive the onset of the Great Depression, closing in December of 1930. The 2 buildings to the north stood across from the entrance to Morgan Street, just before the point where Main Street bends towards the northwest, as shown in this section of the Hartford Atlas of 1917. As I mentioned, this area would be completely transformed when the interstate highway came through. By the time of this photograph, everything on the block had been demolished except for the American Industrial, Leonard, and Strand Theater buildings. Soon, the American Industrial Building would stand alone, but not for long, as it was demolished by implosion in October of 1974. In its place would rise the so-called Stilts Building, a $26 million office tower of 16 floors, completed in 1981. If you enjoyed this video, please consider hitting the subscribe button and the like button, and I thank you for watching.